All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Fair Districts New Mexico Redistricting webinar. My name is Hannah Burling, and I am president of the League of Women Voters of New Mexico. Tonight, we have four panelists: Dick Mason, the project leader for Fair Districts New Mexico, Kathleen Burke, our coordinator, Justice Edward Chavez, and Judge Roderick Kennedy. Justice Chavez is a former justice and chief justice of the New Mexico Supreme Court. He was born in Santa Fe and received his undergraduate degree from Eastern New Mexico University. He was appointed to the Supreme Court by Governor Bill Richardson and served from March 2003 to March 2018. He oversaw the litigation concerning the New Mexico House redistricting maps in 2011. And then Judge Roderick Kennedy, who is a retired judge and chief judge of the New Mexico Court of Appeals, to which he was appointed in 1999 and 2001. He was elected to the court in 2002 and retained in 2004 and 2012. He received his BA from the College of Worcester and his JD from the University of Toledo. Judge Kennedy served as a criminal and civil metropolitan judge in Albuquerque for 11 years and handled about 65,000 cases. He also has been designated to serve on every level of court in the state of New Mexico at one time or another. Judge Kennedy was a pro tem judge for the Jicarilla Apache Nation. Known more for his work with regard to science and the law, he was also the co-chairman of the 2020 New Mexico Redistricting Task Force. I'm now going to turn things over to Kathleen.
Thank you, Hannah. I was just browsing the list of attendees. It looks like we have about 50 folks with us tonight. So I want to say a very big welcome to all of you. Thank you especially to citizens of New Mexico who've joined us tonight to learn more about redistricting and to hear it from the judge and the justice especially. And thank you to partners of ours of Fair Districts New Mexico. Some of these leaders are on the call, so welcome everyone. Without further ado, we're going to start by watching 7 minutes of a video that was made for Fair Districts. And this video is starring our very own Senator Mark Moores and Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino. And they're going to give us some straight talk about redistricting in New Mexico. So I'll cue this up and we'll watch this for 7 minutes and then we'll hear from our guests.
Kathleen, can I just mention that this video was made before the constitutional amendment was passed, making the Public Regulation Commission appointed. So it mentions that there is responsibility for that, but that no longer is subject to redistricting since they were appointed. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, great. Thanks for clarifying that.
Fair Districts for New Mexico. Getting redistricting right in 2021. Two New Mexico state senators talk about New Mexico redistricting. First, a little background. The New Mexico Constitution assigns the responsibility for redistricting congressional districts, New Mexico Senate and House District, the Public Regulation Commission, and the Public Education Commission to the legislature. This happens every 10 years. A growing number of states have reformed their redistricting process to make it fair and transparent. New Mexico has not. The 2001 and 2011 redistricting cycles ended up in the courts, costing taxpayers an additional $7 million in legal fees. In New Mexico, legislators get to choose their constituents instead of constituents choosing their legislators. Let's hear what two New Mexico state senators have to say about past redistricting and how we may get the 2021 redistricting cycle right.
We went through a very elaborate process of holding hearings. The committee was actually, I think, 38 or 40 member committee. And we went all over the state. Every corner of the state we had hearings. We had public input right and left. We had all sorts of possible scenarios drawn up. And then after that whole summer spent doing that and spending a great deal of money, legislators traveling around the state, visiting parts of the state they may never have seen previously, we came back to Santa Fe and sat down and threw all of that out and did our own maps. It became in large measure an incumbent protection process. I don't think in New Mexico it was as much partisan. There may be some, Mark might have a different view of it, but for the most part, it was how do we protect the current members from any potential threat of losing in a subsequent election. And so there are something like 15 communities in the state that were divided in the middle. Taos, for example, Alamogordo, there are all sorts of scenarios in which the community, which you would think would be held together as a contiguous whole with similar interests and similar concerns, was divided up. Now, I have to say that a lot of communities like that. They want that. It makes it twice as influential in the legislative process. If you have two senators representing a given community, Gallup, for example, two senators representing each senator is supposed to have 50,000 people living in their district. That's the target. If you have two senators representing the city of Gallup, and then radiating out into nearby areas, it gives the city of Gallup a lot of influence that otherwise it wouldn't have. So it's not that kind of incumbent protection didn't draw a lot of attention from the communities. They liked it. But it means, for example, and I clearly remember several instances in which incumbents said, oh, don't include those precincts in my district, even though it made more sense from a lot of reasons, because some of those precincts have living within them prospective potential opponents for me in the primary, and I just don't want to have to face them. You know, the way New Mexico is broken out, you've got Republican strengths in the Northwest, in some of the Albuquerque Heights, and in the Southeast. And it almost doesn't matter how you redistrict in those areas, because you're going to have strong Republican representation in those areas. Where it becomes a little dicier is in the margins. And that's where all the battles seem to focus on. How do you make a district invulnerable to the potential that a Republican might, God forbid, be elected? That was a real process. And it was just kind of, this is harsh, probably unnecessarily harsh, but it felt like a sham process that we had gone through, going around the state, having all these hearings, and then just ignored all of that and said to each incumbent, well, how do you want to divide your district up? And then we tried to make it work so that everybody had what they wanted, guaranteed victory in the primary.
And everyone thinks that Santa Fe is so partisan, and it's not necessarily a lot of issues. My first taste at the redistricting battles was in 2001. I served as chief of staff for the then lieutenant governor during that lawsuit. So I was on the sidelines and saw that process. And we were named, since he was president of the Senate, in the lawsuit, which basically meant we were able to hire a lawyer, one more lawyer in the very litigious process that went on that year. And so I knew that was not the right way to do redistricting. And what Jerry said was correct. And you'll notice that he didn't talk a lot, though he did talk some about the Republican-Democrat redistricting and incumbent protection process. A lot of what happens in redistricting, as Jerry mentioned, was about primaries. Since we don't have open primaries, and since we have a closed system in New Mexico, and because of redistricting also, most of the elections are won in the primaries. Jerry in his district has to more worry about his primary election. In my district, I have to worry about my primary election much more than my general election, and him also. And so what you see is an incumbent protection program to, like as Jerry said, cut out potential opponents in your primary. And also another incumbent is leadership. Those who would control the legislative process on both sides, Republican and Democrat, make sure redistricting is an opportunity to pull people out of their caucus who might be a threat to them to make sure that they keep into the leadership position. And that happens a lot. And what Jerry mentioned earlier, on the Republican side, we had 2 senators from Alamogordo in eastern New Mexico, which tends to be more Republican. But we don't have a single senator from Clovis. We don't have one from Carlsbad. We don't have one who actually lives in the city of Roswell. So you see how these things play out at the micro level when you start dealing with internal caucus leadership issues, and then that keeps moving on to leadership of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So a lot of people like to talk about this being Republican, Democrat. And I could tell you it's much more knife fight in the trenches when it gets down to the caucus level fighting that happens when you're trying to make sure your district is perfect for your election. And the horse trading and the fighting that happens at that level is much more intense a lot of times than it is between Republicans and Democrats.
What is the major issue around the redistricting process? Why is it requiring so many years of effort
Let me
to
bring this up and move on from here.
It should be basic to our democracy.
Well, if I can pull it up again.
I think I can only talk about New Mexico, really, because I don't know about any other state and their experience with it. But I think in New Mexico, because we've
So
held it
let me get
close
to that.
the
But
vest,
first, let me say, I'm going to
behind
talk over them
closed
for a
doors
moment until I get to it.
come up with these maps.
This video was
that
originally done by
satisfy us.
Retake Our Democracy
Then
out
we
of
spring
Santa
them on
Fe.
the public.
So we want to say a big thank
It's
you
just
to
it's
Retake
like
Our
a red flag in
Democracy.
front of a bull.
And
Of
with that,
course
I'm
you're
going to
gonna have
find
legal
this
challenges.
video and
You've
turn
done
it off.
something, and even
So
if-
we don't have to listen
If
to
what
it.
the court ultimately approves is not significantly better than what we had come up with, it's just the way we went about it. Really only 2 considerations.
There we go. So with that, thank you for your attention. I'll turn it over now to Justice Edward Chavez, former Justice Edward Chavez, and Judge Roderick Kennedy. Thank you, guys. Go ahead.
Thank you, Kathleen. So Judge Kennedy, you want to talk about criteria that task force considered and will recommend to the legislature?
Sure, I can do that. The last redistricting process in the legislature was governed by a set of what were called guidelines. My recollection is there were 7 of them, the subparts. And the guidelines were basically, some of them were absolutes. For instance, all congressional districts have to be virtually identical populations, I mean, even populations between the 3 of them. That other districts have to be contiguous, that they have to be compact, and also that they reflect within a certain amount equal populations as well. But the first thing is the United States Constitution requires equally proportioned congressional districts based on the Senate or the census, and that is it. I mean, there's no deviation from that. When you get down to state elections, there is some deviation permitted, and that's where all of a sudden we were looking at guidelines rather than having the power of the U.S. Constitution behind it. And having guidelines as opposed to more hard and fast rules leads to, as Senators Ortiz-Pino and Moores just talked about, some fairly odd bits of arguments and deal making and so on when redistricting happens that may not even reflect not only the voting makeup of various districts or who has an interest in a particular district, or if there are communities of interest in a particular district that need to be kept together, as much as it might be the legislators involved themselves and their own personal interests. And one of the criticisms of the process has been that the legislators pick their voters more than the voters pick their legislators. And that's been disturbing. New Mexico First, on the basis of much criticism from a lot of sides about the redistricting process, and it's not being governed by very tight criteria, put together this task force that we started our work in October, went through mid-December. And it was a task force made up of 25 people of various ethnicities, various political stripes, various qualifications. I mean, we had people who were experts in geography and geographical data input. We had people who have done a lot of redistricting. We had Native Americans, we had legislators and so on, to get together and take a look at the guidelines, also take a look at what we thought New Mexico's needs for redistricting would be going forward now in 2021. And we came up with a series of recommendations, and I'll go through them very briefly. The first one, of course, is congressional districts shall be as equal in population as practical. That was the first guideline anyway, and there's no reason to change it because that's the US Constitution talking. The second guideline is state districts should be substantially equal in population. No plans for state office will be considered that include any district with a total population that deviates more than plus or minus 5% than the ideal. And that is basically a total perhaps of 10%, plus or minus 5 from each other, but that all of them will be within that 5% of each other. And that would be consistent with the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act, which is still in effect, and or traditional redistricting principles. We'll talk about some of those later. Some of this requires could read that substantially equal in population, no plans for state office will be considered that include any district with a total population that deviates more than plus or minus 5%, unless the legislature specifically says why. Consistent with subsections 5 and 7, they chose population deviations that were greater. Some of that maybe there's a mountain range in the middle of in between a couple of districts or so on that might require a little bit of population shifting. Recommendation 3, all redistricting plans shall use only single member districts. That was a guideline. We don't recommend a change. Multiple representatives out of a single district have been used in the past to concentrate votes. You've heard about it with the Georgia runoffs, for instance, for the recent Senate race. That when you have multiple groups, you can knock out the weakest candidate and then concentrate on other strong candidates to the exclusion of communities that don't have so many votes. Recommendation 4, congressional districts will be drawn using the most recent federal decennial census data generated by the U.S. Bureau of the Census, that's the Constitution. Other districts will be drawn using the most recent census data, but that data may be complemented by other sources, and there are other sources that are actually more particular in some ways than census data. Recommendation 5, districts will be composed of convenient contiguous territory, and areas that meet only at the pointed corners are not contiguous. 6, districts may be drawn using precincts or smaller units. Recommendation 7, partisan data such as voting history or party registration shall not be used to draw districts. In other words, keeping the political considerations out so everybody can have a fair shake based on who the people are rather than how they vote. Districts should be reasonably compact in form. That usually means that those are districts that are square, rectangular, or hexagonal in shape, not irregularly shaped to the extent permitted by natural or governmental boundaries. If it's necessary to compare the relative compactness of 2 or more districts or 2 or more alternative redistricting plans, there will be tests for doing that. We can talk about those. Recommendation 9, we have underserved communities in New Mexico. Some of that can be shown because of diverse impacts in terms of delivery of medical care, delivery of economic benefits, health benefits, food benefits, and communities of interest as well, both ethnic and racial and language based, exist in New Mexico as well. And we decided that requires more detailed definition and attention when districts are being drawn in terms of what communities of interest look like. Districts need to be drawn, and I'm down to 10 now, consistent with the traditional districting principles, but must not be drawn to favor a political party or incumbent office holder. And that's what Senator Ortiz-Pino was talking about. Incumbency, you can't draw a district to protect somebody who already has the office. Districts shall avoid splitting communities of interest, which are defined as contiguous populations that share common economic, social, or cultural interests. In addition, when feasible, districts shall minimize fragmentation of government subdivisions. Number 12, providing the previous criteria of followed, new districts shall preserve cores of existing districts. Recommendation 13, which is kind of why we're here in big part, establish a nonpartisan independent advisory board to develop maps for the legislature's selection. In other words, put it in independent hands, nonpartisan hands. Recommendation 14, formally include and authentically consider redistricting maps submitted by the public using an online map drawing tool. And if you are not aware of that, there are tons, okay, maybe 6 or 7, very, very good, but they're very heavy, map drawing tools that will allow you to draw district maps and take into account communities of interest, ethnic diversity, language diversity, political diversity, and so on. And they're many of them are free to use, and they're absolutely incredible. And if you decide that you would like to take a shot at it, you can try and submit those, and submit your own, or get a bunch of people with you to submit your own maps that can be considered by the commission. Recommendation 15, require the collection of public input through minimum hearings and online comments, and establish a website and media outreach strategy to keep the public well informed. And those were our 16 recommendations, which are published. You can find them at the New Mexico First website at nmfirst.org. And the pamphlet itself, I think, goes, there's probably almost a full page explanation for each of those recommendations and why it was that we were chosen, that they were chosen. The other thing that I'll point out is each and every one of those had to have a vote of at least 85% of everybody on the task force before it was adopted. Some of them weren't, or some that you don't see here weren't. That's why you don't see them. But everyone here had at least 85%, and quite a few of them had unanimous and high end of the 90% support. So that's about it for me.
Judge, I'm going to put the report, the findings in the chat for people. So anybody who you'll be able to link from the chat to look at.
That'd be great.
Well, Judge Kennedy, I was really happy to be asked to serve on the task force and the co-chair with you, but really the reason I was excited about it is because I wrote the opinion 10 years ago, the majority opinion that dealt with redistricting, and we tried to lay out the principles, and we also rejected the House district map and sent it back down for the district court judge to reconsider. Basically for a couple of major reasons, and then some that were not as important. But one was because of the partisan bias of the House district map that was approved by the judge at the time. And secondly, they had split some communities in part. And the question was, well, can you have more competitive districts rather than these partisan biased House districts? And is there really a need to split up some of these cities and villages? And it went back down, and the judge was able to make the adjustments. It became more competitive, and all but one city were not split. So I think that made a difference because, as I recall, in New Mexico, the House at one time was controlled by the Republican Party. And so you saw that if you make districts more competitive, that it could work. Not all districts are going to be competitive. I mean, the reality is when people move in and move out of districts, that Sometimes policies and interests change, but many times it doesn't. So I was real happy to be invited on the commission, and we think we have a good solution with the legislation that we will introduce through the legislators who are on the task force that will address many of the problems that the senators spoke about in their video. You know, one, the infighting, the protection of incumbents, the fact that they spend lots of money going around the state talking to the public, but then discarding what the public had to say. And then, of course, there was over $6 million in attorney fees and costs because of the litigation. And in the last 2 decades, the legislature wasn't able to adopt maps that were constitutional and complied with all the laws. And we think this legislation will stop that. And the crux of it, in my mind, is the establishment of the advisory commission. Let me first tell the public what the membership of the commission. It's going to be 7 members. 1 will be selected by the Senate president. 1 will be selected by the Senate minority leader. And they will select somebody from each of the major parties. The House Speaker and the minority leader on the House side will also select. And then the State Ethics Commission that was recently created will select the last 3. 2 of them will be voters in New Mexico who are not a member of the Democrat or Republican Party. And then finally, they will select either a retired Supreme Court justice or retired Court of Appeals judge to chair the advisory committee. And we believe that that balance will lend itself to reducing some of the partisanship that takes place during redistricting. Now, the duties are really critical because what it does is it helps the legislators in the sense that this commission will gather information from the public. The information will be recorded under the State Records Act. It will be made available to the public to see on a website. And then the committee will make a recommendation to the legislature by submitting a report that summarizes or highlights the input from the public and justifies each map that is recommended to the legislature. Ultimately, the commission is going to recommend from 3 to 5 maps for each district, the congressional district, the state house, the state senate, and the public education commission. And each map is going to be justified. And also what's important is the commission will tell the legislature which map for each district it considers to be the best map that accomplishes all of the criteria that Judge Kennedy just spoke about. But to get there, the plan is to have at least 12 public meetings that comply with the Open Meetings Act. The first 6 will be devoted to trying to get information from the public before maps are proposed for adoption by the advisory committee. So there will be at least six different meetings throughout the state of New Mexico, so the public will have the input. Again, that information will be recorded under the State Records Act. And then the second set of meetings will take that public input. We will, or the commission will draw maps that they will propose, and they will give another 30 days notice to the public. We'll then hold hearings throughout the state and solicit public input before the committee votes on which maps to recommend to the legislature. That makes the system transparent because the public gets to witness the discussions. They get to listen to the public testimony. They get to listen to the deliberations of the advisory committee members, and they also get to see them vote. Once a decision is made and the 3 to 5 maps are recommended to the legislature, then the legislature participates because they decide which of the 3 to 5 maps for each district to adopt. They will also have public meetings, and ultimately, if, for example, they decide not to adopt one of the maps, the map that was recommended by the committee as the best that complies with all of the the criteria adopted by the legislature would then be sent to the governor for approval. Now, there's always a hitch, right? There's a possibility that somebody may want to challenge a map that was adopted by the committee. We are proposing a system that would allow a party who makes a presentation at the advisory committee level to file a lawsuit if they believe that the map is unconstitutionally drawn or violates the Voting Rights Act or doesn't comply with the legislative criteria that was set forth. They would be able to go directly to the New Mexico Supreme Court, keeping in mind that there's already a record of the evidence that was presented to the committee. The Supreme Court would then have a briefing schedule and would, before maps are submitted to the legislature, decide whether or not the challenge map should be annulled or voided because it is unconstitutional or some other irregularity with federal or state law. Or alternatively, the court would say that it satisfies both federal and state law. Then it would go to the legislature. We hope to accomplish all this between April 1st and October 15th. And you might say, well, that's ridiculous. But the 10 years ago, in September, the legislature made their decision to propose maps. The governor vetoed some and some they were unable to agree to. So no maps were adopted in 2011. Of course, lawsuits were filed in September, lots of motions by the attorneys. Eventually, the judge held, I think it was 8 or 10 days of hearings from expert witnesses and members of the public, much like what the committee is charged with doing under our legislation. And then ultimately, the House district could not be decided. So it went to the Supreme Court in the middle of January of 2012. That's like 6 weeks away from when people had to announce their candidacy for the House. And they didn't know what their district was going to look like. So it made it difficult. They wouldn't even know if they lived in the district that they intended to run for. Despite it being filed in the middle of January, by February 10th, the Supreme Court had read the briefs, the record, and entered a detailed order to the court, sending it back down to reconsider the map that was drawn. And by February 20th, the Supreme Court had issued a comprehensive opinion that explained the rationale for its ruling. And Judge Hall was able to make a decision by the end of February, and that decision was not appealed, and the changes were made. So it's very doable, but it is an aggressive schedule. But after all, this is our democracy we're talking about. The essence of redistricting is really to give everybody a fair and equal opportunity to elect a representative of their choice. And that's what redistricting accomplishes. So I think that what the task force has done is going to make a tremendous difference going forward in New Mexico if it's adopted by the legislature and approved by the governor. There will be an emergency clause in the legislation, and if it can take effect immediately once the governor approves it. I know there must be many questions for Judge Kennedy or myself.
There are a few.
Now a good time or?
Yeah, let's have a few questions. Thank you, Justice. So it's October, right, when we expect to have our new districts in place? That's right.
October 15th, they will be submitted to the legislature.
Okay.
In the legislature and governor will have to call a special session. But that's the timing we are proposing, the middle of October. Of course, the legislature will take whatever time they need. And but with the record and with testimony from committee members that summarize the public input that we received and describe the rationale for proposing the maps, I think even the legislative process should be more efficient.
So we could expect this to be done, say, by the 1st of 2022?
I would say sometime November of 2021.
That's good to know.
You know,
So
2-3
thank you so much,
months
Kristen.
before.
I'll move on to the next one. Vicky asked, is there any coordination at the national level to do this same type of bipartisan redistricting? Vicky, there is, for sure, the League of Women Voters of the United States has an effort going on across the country to have this same kind of work happening in all of the states. And there are, I do know the Democratic Party has a nationwide program going on, and I'm sure that some other not-for-profits, good government groups are doing projects as well. Here in New Mexico, it's led by us, Fair Districts New Mexico, and we are a project of the League of Women Voters, and we are fully funded by the Thornburg Foundation. So,
Kathleen, can I just make a comment on that? 14 states already have some form of independent redistricting commission, and at least 10 other states, and that number is growing all the time, have put reforms in place recently about improving their redistricting process. So this is something that's moving across the country. You know, there's a lot more attention being paid now to redistricting than there was in 2011 or 2001. So,
yeah, I think this is one of the first formalized efforts in New Mexico, and certainly the first that it's been such a large effort. So we're very grateful. Fair Districts New Mexico has 22 statewide partners in this effort and 3 national partners. And so someone has asked, is there a link to the report? Yes, in the chat, we have placed a link to the full task force report. And I'll let someone else answer this question. Does the redistricting have to wait until after we have the final results of the census?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
The answer is yes, but I think Judge Kennedy made the point that although there will be reliance on the census data, we are asking the legislature to also specify that other valid and reliable data may be considered by the committee when redistricting. There's a lot of concern about whether or not there's going to be an accurate census because of the COVID-19 virus, and also the inability to really arrange for the census to be taken in New Mexico. And also something that they're doing is introducing noise so that there's no, I guess there won't be unintentional revealing of personal data. And so there are some concerns, and I think it's important for New Mexico to try to get it right, to try to get the populations as equal as possible with the districts. So I think that's an important consideration for all of the districts.
I mean, in past years, I mean, there have been undercounts of certain populations that have impacted New Mexico. You know, one of the concerns, for instance, out on the Navajo reservation with with COVID restricting people from moving around a lot, both census counters and members of the population, not getting out to to places where there is one family in the middle of 50 square miles. And how many, and whether or not there would be people counted there. But the census also has, as they go on in between the big census, they do population studies that result in things, for instance, called census blocks, which are more finely defined units of demographics. And our groups talked a lot about the use of census blocks. GIS data. The University of New Mexico has a very solid GIS department. One of our members was a geographer as well, a professor of geography. And all of those things can be combined for other purposes for the state districts in ways that the U.S. Constitution doesn't allow for with the congressional districts. And we won't know probably until February or March, perhaps, about how the U.S. Census is actually shaping up. But in the meantime, other preparations can be made to start picking sources of data for other purposes.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Justice. Dick, here's a question for you from Amber. What is Native American involvement now at this moment?
We had the executive director of the Native American Voters Alliance on the task force. We had Senator Shannon Pinto from Navajo Nation on the task force. We had the redistricting guru, Leonard Gorman, who is the executive director of the Navajo Nation Human Rights Council or Commission. And we had a presentation from the Pueblos on their interest in this issue. So there was a lot of concern. And one of the things I should mention about, this was, this was mentioned in the task force. One of the public hearings will be concentrated on Native Americans. It'll be exclusively for Native Americans. So to get their input, the last cycle, they actually submitted a consolidated plan. I don't know whether they're planning on doing that this time, but they did. So one of the public hearings will be exclusively for Native Americans.
I'll just add to that, Dick. I believe Edward Chavez of the Native American Voters Alliance was also on the task force.
Yep.
Yes.
And from what I understand, Mr. Leonard Gorman is a redistricting rock star too.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we could have him on the rock star show. Okay, so moving on, Dick, I'll give you this question as well. Laura asks, what is the position of the speaker and the president pro tem on this issue?
Can we hold that off? I'm going to talk about how the bill is going to move through the session. And so can we hold that off?
Absolutely.
Okay, till after I.
We're at 7:11. Shall we ask a few more questions, Dick, before we can? 20 minutes to go.
Why don't we wait? Why don't I just talk about the legislative process, and then we can ask all the questions together so that, okay. So with the help of the justice and the judge and other members of the task force, the bill is in legislative council service now for drafting. The lead sponsors, we are planning on introducing the bill in the Senate. And lead sponsors are Senator Moores and Senator Etiza Pino. So the track we see is, historically redistricting bills or voting bills in general have gone through Senate rules and Senate judiciary. So we see them going through those two committees. And our advocacy effort is going to be focused on those two committees. And then, once we get to the Senate floor, then there'll be a more general of, all the members of the Senate to get them passed. And as the justice mentioned, this does have an emergency clause, and that makes it a little bit more difficult. So, I forget, it's two-thirds vote. For something with an emergency clause, it takes effect immediately, because usually legislation takes place, later on. There are set dates for it to take place. So having an emergency clause, which we need to get this process moving. So it's going to create a little bit more barrier getting it through the Senate. And then, going over the House, we will then, it usually goes through, normally it would go through Representative Georgine Lewis's committee, which is state government, elections, and Indian affairs. That is usually the first committee. And then again, bills like this will also go through House Judiciary, for both, and then it would go to the House floor. And we will concentrate at each level of getting it through each one of those committees. Now, the problem is, we don't know the committee members until after the session starts. We have some inkling from previous meetings, from who was on previously. Senator Moores thinks he is going to be on rules again. the minority leader and the president pro tem, actually the Senate majority leader, asked what their preferences are for committees. And, they try to fulfill that. So we won't actually know the actual committee members until after the session starts. And that's a little bit more barrier. And one more barrier is that the Senate Rules Committee has to do confirmations. Now, it isn't as bad as the first year of the governors where they had so many confirmations, but still there have been people who've left office and have temporary appointments. And so they have to do those appointments, and that is a problem. I've looked at the pre-filed legislation in the Senate, and there aren't, as far as I can see, there are only 2 or 3 bills so far that would go through Senate rules. That's good for us. That means if we get in the queue soon, if our legislation is pre-filed, we will, not be very far down the queue. But we will be putting out notices to people, and, we will put people on this webinar on our list. You can ignore them if you don't want to, but we will be putting out notices as we're moving through the process, asking people to contact their legislators to urge them to either vote in the committee or, eventually vote on the floor. So, and in the meantime, we will be testifying virtually, at the committee hearings at each of these bills. And I'm hoping the judge and the justice will be our expert witnesses, but don't want to put them on the line right now. But that's how we see the bill moving through the legislation. Now, I will ask the question. The speaker the league met with the speaker over a year ago. The speaker said he was open to an advisory committee. And he also said he was open to the criteria being put in statute. We agreed to disagree on the issue of incumbency being considered, okay? So that's what we've heard from the speaker. Now, recently he said he wants to see the legislation before he makes a final decision. So now we already sent him the draft of the legislation. Senator Worth, the Senate Majority Leader, has said that he is open to a hybrid that allows a role for the legislature. This meets that criteria. We have not had anything from the assumed or presumed Senate President Pro Tem, Senator Mimi Stewart. We have not had a statement one way or the other from her. So that's where we stand as far as the leadership goes. Now, one of the things we have to mention is that the Legislative Council has created a redistricting work group. It's Senator Worth, Senator Stuart Ingle, and retiring Senator Clemente Sanchez. We don't actually know the reason for a retiring senator being on it, but and on the House side, it is Speaker Egolf, Representative Stapleton, and Representative Kelly Ferrato, she's the only member of the task force, the redistricting task force, that is on that work group. The judge and the justice have requested a meeting with them to present the findings of the redistricting task force and discuss with them the legislation. And copies of the draft of the legislation has gone to some of the members of that task force. And the justice, and maybe the justice can talk about, you're going to be talking to the governor's office about this, right, Justice?
Correct.
Right. And we have a meeting Friday with the Secretary of State's office, or conference call to discuss. The Secretary has been supportive of redistricting reform. So we have a discussion with her staff on Friday about their support for this legislation. So now, that's it for me.
Okay.
Questions?
Yes, we will go to some more questions, and I'll just say in a few minutes, I'm going to show everyone our website, and you'll be able to see where we have lots of links to tools that will help during the session, help you to reach your legislators, as well as tools for doing your own research and tools for remaining updated. So one moment. One person says that they feel there should be a mountain district where our interests and needs are similar, and that's true. The whole purpose of having communities of interest is to keep people with certain concerns together. And on that, I'll address the question that George asks. He says communities of interest seems a nebulous concept. I see the reference you provided, and the abstract admits it's ambiguous. It also seems to run contrary to the current movement toward diversity, inclusion, and equity, fostering segregation, in other words. Can you address this? I'll say a few quick things to that, George, which would be that it's become known across the country that keeping communities of interest together is beneficial to fair redistricting. And I have not been exposed to anything otherwise yet at this point. And I would invite anybody on the panel who has been exposed to otherwise, please speak up. But at this point, the trend is definitely clearly toward keeping communities of interest together, that there is power in that. Anybody want to add to that?
I could just say that, actually that can be the basis for lawsuits. That if you split up communities of interest, you are diluting their power in the legislature. But actually, I'll let the judges, because they're better at just. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's a good summary of the issue. Communities of interest take into consideration, economic, social, and cultural interest. And in fact, 10 years ago, the Native American population filed a multi-tribal district plan, and the court analyzed it under the Voting Rights Act. And what the US Supreme Court has said is that communities of interest can be considered when you are looking at the Voting Rights Act. As a result of that, the court adopted in total the multi-state, the multi-tribal map that was proposed. And so communities of interest are always going to be a valid consideration. I don't see that ever changing. And there's packing and there's cracking of communities of interest. You could bring all the community of interest that are in a large area, multi-village, multi-city, and try to bring them together so that you dilute their vote by giving them only one representative. Or you can crack them by having a community of interest in a city and splitting up that city or that community of interest a couple of different ways, again, to dilute their vote. That leads directly to a Voting Rights Act violation.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. So Senator Feldman asks, how does this square with the SCOTUS decision that partisan gerrymandering is okay? Who wants to talk about that?
Well, from my perspective, the US Supreme Court did not say that it was okay. They said they would no longer arbitrate whether or not there was political gerrymandering, and they would leave it to the states to consider. So that'd be a viable claim that somebody could still bring in New Mexico, and they would bring it to the Supreme Court under what we are proposing as the appellate process.
The U.S. Supreme Court has a thing called the political question doctrine, and they stay out of the business of other branches of government, and that was the basis for their decision there. And they also stay out of the intramural politics of the states. But it's still a very viable lawsuit within the states.
Thank you. Dick or anyone, do you know, Shelley asks, Thank you, Shelley. Do the tribes still have the same stance from 10 years ago?
That is really up to them. I mean, it was really great that, all the tribes got together and put together a unified plan the last time. And, we hope they are. I mean, they are at a disadvantage now because we know how devastating the pandemic has been to, the tribes. And when we tried to get them involved, many just said, please leave us alone right now, because we're so burdened with dealing with the pandemic. So we hope they will get together. I mean, that is such power to have all the Pueblos and the tribes submit a unified plan. So yes, Shelley, we hope they do follow the same route for this session, but we know what they're dealing with. It's going to be really difficult for them.
So I'm going to take just a quick few moments to show the audience our website. And as promised, we're going to look at ways, helpful tools here. Here's Fair Districts for New Mexico, our website. And this top section is what I want to draw your attention to, Legislative Advocacy 2021. You'll see the informational one-pager on the Redistricting Senate bill. Also, it's called the Redistricting Act. We don't have a bill draft yet. We expect it any moment. But for now, we just have the informational one-pager. Please see that. We have a list of our state senators and where they currently stand as far as we know on redistricting. We have stances according to region, the stances of the legislators. And at the bottom here, we have the most current email addresses for both the sitting legislators and the newly seated ones. So you won't find that yet on the legislature website, but you will find their addresses here. So you remember to refer to this rather than the legislature website. Going down, there's our event of tonight. Here's the full video that we started out with tonight. If you'd like to go and watch the full 16 minutes, you can access it here. We've got an entire list of all the op-eds and letters to the editor that have been written in favor of redistricting reform over the last year and a half. Here's the video from Fair Districts New Mexico that I referred to earlier. We've got some survey results here, lots of other resources. And down at the bottom, we have our contact information. If you care to contact us, it's there. And on that note, I'd like to say that if you do not want us to contact you, please put that in the chat and we will not add you to our mailing list. Otherwise, we are assuming that you're interested and we're going to go ahead and move your email address onto our listserv and you'll start getting emails from us this week.
Kathleen, you didn't mention the PowerPoint that's there if people want to use it.
Sure, yeah, we also have the Fair Districts New Mexico PowerPoint. You're welcome to refer to that as well. That's approximately 15 to 20 PowerPoint slides that you can share with groups. You can watch it at home. You can, again, share it with organizations you might be affiliated with. And we are always accepting partners if you belong to any organizations who would like to sign up to be a supporter of Fair Districts New Mexico. With that, I'll ask our panelists, anybody want to add anything in the last 2 minutes? Please do.
Just one thing, we will, if there are unanswered questions, we will try to answer them personally, right?
Yeah, we can. Let me just, we have another minute and a half, so let's see if there's something new that popped in here that we can answer. Yeah, we have a note that someone said that we don't have many persons of color involved in this. We have been actively from the beginning recruiting, particularly Hispanic and Native organizations to partner with us. That is an ongoing effort. If you belong to any Black, Indigenous, or people of color organizations, we ask you to please reach out to us so that we can help recruit them into this movement. It's very, very important to us. I can't stress that enough, how important it is.
But there was on a task force, you
The
know,
task force,
yeah,
certainly.
there were Hispanic, Native American, African American. So, you know, they were represented on the task force pretty.
Yes, yeah, it was great that way. So
I
Hannah,
think that's why it's very important for us to have the meetings throughout the region and make sure that they're adequately or advertised.
mhm.
We encourage as much public participation from all segments of our communities. And I hope that that will take place with the advisory committee.
I would like to invite Hannah Burling, the League of Women Voters of New Mexico president, to close us out for the evening, if you're ready, Hannah.
Yes. Well, thank you all so much. I'd especially like to thank Justice Chavez and Judge Kennedy for being with us tonight. And I'm just sorry that you cannot, due to the new way that we all live, you can't get the applause that you absolutely deserve. Thank you so much. And good night, everyone.
Good night. Bye, everyone. Thank you.